On September 17th, 2011, at 10:42 in the morning, a John Deere dealer named Rick Torrance stood on a flatbed trailer in the middle of a packed field demonstration in Stoddard County, Missouri, holding a wireless microphone and making a claim he would regret for the rest of his career. He said no Massey Ferguson tractor currently in production had the hydraulic capacity or the torque management to pull a 12-bottom moldboard plow through Missouri clay at full 14-inch depth, without downshifting, without stalling, and without the operator manually adjusting throttle response mid-pass. He said it loud enough for 200 farmers to hear. And one of those farmers, a 58-year-old man named Vernon Gast, who had been standing near the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and his jaw set, heard every word of it. If you understand what it means to watch someone insult the machine you've bet your operation on, the machine you've defended in conversations at the co-op, the machine you've chosen over every other option because you believed it would do what others said it couldn't, then you know this story isn't about a plow demonstration. It's about what happens when a man is given the chance to prove that belief in front of everyone who doubted it, and what happens when he's right. The Stoddard County Farm Progress Show had been running for 23 years by 2011. It was held every September on 640 acres of leased ground west of Bloomfield. Equipment dealers brought their newest iron, chemical companies set up spray demonstrations, seed reps handed out hats and pens, and every year, one dealer sponsored the main field demo, a high-visibility event designed to show off horsepower, hydraulics, and implement compatibility in front of the largest crowd of the weekend. In 2011, Rick Torrance's John Deere dealership, Torrance Ag Solutions, had paid $8,500 to sponsor the demo. Rick had been selling John Deere equipment in southeast Missouri for 19 years. He ran a confident operation. His lot in Dexter carried 40 to 50 pieces of inventory year-round. His service bays were booked 2 weeks out. He moved volume. And part of moving volume, the way Rick saw it, was making sure farmers understood that not all brands were built the same. The field demo that morning was designed around tillage. Rick had brought a John Deere 9530, a four-wheel drive articulated tractor rated at 530 horsepower, hooked to a 12-bottom Vernoland moldboard plow. The plow was set to run at full 14-inch depth. The soil was heavy Missouri clay, the kind that loads up on the moldboards and requires constant hydraulic pressure to keep the plow from lifting out of the ground or stalling the tractor mid-pass. Rick had spent 20 minutes before the demo explaining the engineering behind the 9530's hydraulic system, the closed-center load-sensing design, the independent flow to the rear remote, the programmable pressure settings that allowed the operator to maintain consistent depth without manual adjustment. Then he'd made the comparison. He'd said that some brands, and he didn't name Massey Ferguson directly, but everyone understood what red tractors he was referring to, simply didn't have the architecture to handle this kind of load. Their hydraulic pumps were undersized. Their torque curves dropped off too early under sustained draw. Their electronics couldn't compensate fast enough when the plow hit a hard pan. He'd said a farmer could buy a tractor with a big horsepower number on the side, but if the hydraulics couldn't manage the implement, the number didn't matter. And then he'd said it. No Massey Ferguson currently in production can do what you're about to see this John Deere do. Vernon Gast had been farming 520 acres outside Advance, Missouri since 1979. Corn, soybeans, and winter wheat on rotation. He'd run international harvester equipment through the 1980s, switched to Case IH in the early 90s, and in 2009 he'd bought his first Massey Ferguson, an 8680 rated at 375 horsepower with a Dyna VT continuously variable transmission. He'd bought it used from a dealer in Poplar Bluff. It had 890 hours on it. The price was $142,000, financed over 6 years. The comments weren't hostile. They were skeptical. Massey Ferguson wasn't common in Stoddard County. Most farmers ran John Deere or Case IH. A few ran New Holland. Massey Ferguson was the brand you saw at auctions, the brand that older farmers remembered from the 70s and 80s but hadn't considered in decades. Vernon had defended his choice quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't make speeches. He just said the tractor did what he needed it to do and left it at that. But standing in the field that morning, listening to Rick Torrance tell 200 farmers that no Massey Ferguson could handle the load he was about to demonstrate, Vernon felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when someone gives you the opportunity to stop defending your decision with words and start proving it with work. Rick Torrance climbed into the cab of the John Deere 9530. The crowd moved closer. The plow was already set at 14-inch depth, all 12 bottoms biting into the clay. Rick throttled up, engaged the hydraulics, and started forward. The tractor pulled smooth. The plow cut clean. The hydraulics held pressure. The John Deere moved across the field at a steady 4.2 miles per hour, turning over 12 furrows of black Missouri clay without downshifting, without throttle adjustment, without visible strain. The pass took 4 minutes. Rick made a wide turn at the end of the field and brought the tractor back, stopping near the flatbed trailer. He climbed out, walked back to the microphone, and said, "That's 530 horsepower and a hydraulic system built to manage it. That's what you need for this kind of work." The crowd clapped. A few farmers walked up to inspect the plow, checking the furrows, looking at the mold boards. Rick stood near the trailer talking to a group of potential buyers. Vernon Gast walked toward the flatbed. He was not a tall man, 5'9", broad across the shoulders, wearing a faded blue work shirt and a cap with no logo. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it without theatrics. He stopped near the trailer and said, "Rick." Rick turned. He recognized Vernon, though they'd never done business together. He said, "Vernon, good to see you. What'd you think?" Vernon said, "I think you're wrong." Rick's expression shifted slightly. He said, "About what?" Vernon said, "About Massey Ferguson." The conversation around them went quiet. Rick said, "Vernon, I'm not trying to start an argument. I'm just telling people what the engineering says." Vernon said, "The engineering on my 8680 says 375 horsepower and 80 gallons per minute on the hydraulic pump. You're telling me that won't pull what your 9530 just pulled?" Rick looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I'm saying the architecture isn't designed for sustained high-load implement work. It's a different system. It's built for a different purpose." Vernon said, "Then let me prove you wrong." Rick didn't answer right away. The crowd had grown larger now. Farmers standing with their arms crossed, watching. Rick said, "You brought your 8680? Vernon said, "It's parked on the road. I can have it here in 5 minutes." Rick looked at the crowd, then he looked at Vernon, and he made the decision that would cost him more than he understood in that moment. He said, "All right, hook it up." Vernon drove the Massey Ferguson 8680 into the field at 10:58. It was red, clean, and smaller in physical presence than the John Deere 9530. The crowd noticed the difference immediately. The 9530 was an articulated four-wheel drive machine, massive and imposing. The 8680 was a row crop tractor, narrower, more conventional in layout. Vernon backed it up to the Vernoland plow. 2 farmers from the crowd helped him hook the drawbar and connect the hydraulic lines. Vernon climbed into the cab, set the remote flow, and engaged the hydraulics. The plow lifted smoothly. Rick Torrance stood near the flatbed with his arms crossed. A man next to him, another dealer, said quietly, "This isn't going to end well for him." Rick didn't respond. Vernon throttled the Massey Ferguson up to 1900 RPM. He lowered the plow to full 14-inch depth. All 12 bottoms bit into the same clay the John Deere had just turned. Vernon engaged the transmission, set it to field mode, and started forward. The Massey Ferguson pulled. The engine sound was different from the John Deere's, deeper, more mechanical. The Dyna VT transmission held the tractor at a consistent 4.1 miles per hour without shift brakes. The hydraulics maintained pressure on the plow, keeping all 12 bottoms at depth as the tractor moved across the field. Vernon did not touch the throttle. He did not adjust the hydraulic settings. He kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, watching the furrows turn over behind him in the mirrors. The crowd watched in silence. At the halfway point, one of the farmers said, "It's not downshifting." Another said, "Look at the furrows. They're consistent." Rick Torrance said nothing. Vernon completed the pass in 4 minutes and 11 seconds, 9 seconds slower than the John Deere's time. He made the turn at the end of the field, brought the tractor back, and stopped near the flatbed trailer. He shut down the engine, climbed out, and walked toward Rick. The crowd followed. Vernon stopped in front of Rick and said, 375 horsepower, Massey Ferguson, full depth, no downshift. Rick looked at him. Then he looked at the field. The furrows were clean. The plow had stayed at depth. The Massey Ferguson had done exactly what Vernon said it would do. Rick said, "You made your point." Vernon said, "I'm not trying to make a point. I'm just correcting what you told these people." Rick's jaw tightened. He said, "The 9530 still pulled it faster." Vernon said, 9 seconds over a quarter mile. You want to tell me that's worth the extra $160,000? Rick didn't answer. Vernon turned and walked back to his tractor. He unhooked the plow, climbed into the cab, and drove the Massey Ferguson out of the field. The crowd watched him go. Then they turned back to Rick Torrance, and the questions started. The first question came from a farmer named Ed Pulliam, who farmed 980 acres south of Bloomfield and had been considering a new John Deere 8335R. Ed said, "Rick, you said no Massey could handle that load. That one just did." Rick said, "Ed, I'm talking about sustained work. A single pass doesn't tell you what happens across 500 acres. Ed said, "Vernon's been running that tractor for 2 years. You're saying it can't sustain what it just did for 4 minutes?" Rick said, "I'm saying the architecture is different." Another farmer, a man named Carl Dietrich, said, "Different how?" Rick said, "The hydraulic pump on the 8680 is an open center system. It's less efficient under variable load than a closed center design." Carl said, "But it held pressure for the full pass." Rick said, "On a demonstration." Carl said, "On the same clay your John Deere just pulled." Rick didn't respond. A third farmer said, "What's an 8680 cost compared to the 9530? Rick said, "That's not the comparison you should be making." The farmer said, "Why not?" Rick said, "Because they're different machines." The farmer said they just did the same work. The conversation went on for another 10 minutes. Rick answered every question with the same defensive precision he'd used to promote the John Deere before Vernon showed up. But the tone had changed. The crowd wasn't asking about the John Deere anymore. They were asking why Rick had said what he'd said about Massey Ferguson when what they'd just watched contradicted it. By 11:30, Rick had walked back to his dealership tent. The field demo was over. The crowd dispersed slowly, most of them heading toward the equipment displays, some of them talking in small groups near the fence line. Rick stood in the tent alone, staring at the field where Vernon's furrows ran parallel to his own. He didn't know it yet, but what had just happened wasn't going to stay in that field. Ed Pulliam went home that afternoon and sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Louise. He'd been planning to trade his 2004 Case IH MX255 toward a new John Deere 8335R. The John Deere dealer in Dexter had offered him $78,000 on trade. The new tractor would cost $246,000 after the trade, financed over 7 years. Ed had been comfortable with that decision until he'd watched Vernon Gast pull the same plow Rick Torrance had pulled with a tractor that cost $100,000 less. Louise said, "What are you thinking?" Ed said, "I'm thinking Rick Torrance told 200 people that no Massey Ferguson could do what I just watched one do." Louise said, "So what does that mean?" Ed said, "It means I need to talk to the Massey Ferguson dealer in Poplar Bluff." Ed called the dealer, a man named Frank Elbert, on Monday morning. Frank had been selling Massey Ferguson equipment in southeast Missouri for 14 years. He was a small operation, 4 service bays, 15 to 20 tractors on the lot at any given time. Frank said, "Ed, I heard about what happened at the field demo." Ed said, "You did?" Frank said, "Vernon called me Saturday night, Puff. He thought I should know." Ed said, "I'm interested in the 8680. Can you get me numbers?" Frank said, "I can have a unit here by Wednesday if you want to test it." Ed said, "I'll be there Thursday." Ed drove to Poplar Bluff on Thursday, September 22nd. He spent 2 hours running the Massey Ferguson 8680 through field work on Frank Elbert's demo farm. He pulled a chisel plow, he ran a grain cart, he tested the hydraulics under load, the transmission under variable speed, the cab comfort during extended operation. By the end of the test, Ed had made his decision. He bought the 8680 for $168,000, trading his Case IH MX255 at $74,000. The finance terms were 6 years at 4.9%. He took delivery on October 1st. When the John Deere dealer in Dexter called to follow up on the 8335R, Ed told them he'd gone a different direction. The dealer asked what direction. Ed said Massey Ferguson. The dealer said, "You're joking." Ed said, "I'm not." The dealer said, "Ed, we had a deal on the table." Ed said, "You didn't have a deal. You had an offer. And after I watched Rick Torrance tell everyone that Massey Ferguson couldn't do what Vernon Gast's tractor did in 4 minutes, I decided to find out for myself." The dealer said, "That was a demonstration. That wasn't real work." Ed said, "Then why did Rick set it up?" The dealer didn't answer. Ed hung up. Carl Dietrich bought a Massey Ferguson 8690 in November. He'd been running John Deere equipment since 1989. He traded a 2008 John Deere 8330 and a 2006 7820 toward the Massey Ferguson and a used Massey Ferguson 9895 combine. Rick Torrance lost both deals. A third farmer, a man named Raymond Stoll, bought a Massey Ferguson 8670 in January 2012. He'd been planning to buy a John Deere 8285R. He'd test-driven it twice. He'd had his banker run the finance numbers. But after the field demo in September, Raymond had started asking questions about hydraulic architecture, torque curves, and cost per horsepower. The numbers didn't support the John Deere. Raymond bought the Massey Ferguson for $151,000. He told Rick Torrance's sales manager that if Rick hadn't made the claim about Massey Ferguson, Raymond wouldn't have looked at them. The sales manager asked what claim. Raymond said, "Ask Rick." By March 2012, Rick Torrance's dealership had lost 6 confirmed sales to Massey Ferguson. 3 tractors, 2 combines, 1 planter. Total lost revenue, including trade-ins and finance fees, was approximately $680,000. Rick called a meeting with his sales team. He asked them what they were hearing in the field. The sales manager said, "They're saying you got embarrassed at the field demo." Rick said, "I didn't get embarrassed. Vernon Gast pulled a plow. That's all that happened." The sales manager said, "You told 200 people no Massey Ferguson could do it. Then one did." Rick said, "I was talking about sustained work over time, not a single demonstration pass." The sales manager said, "That's not what people heard." Rick said, "Then we need to clarify." The sales manager said, "Rick, you can't clarify what people watched with their own eyes." Rick didn't respond. In April 2012, John Deere's regional territory manager, a man named Stephen Voss, visited Rick's dealership in Dexter. Stephen had been tracking sales declines across southeast Missouri and had identified Torrance Ag Solutions as a concern area. Stephen said, "Rick, your Q1 numbers are down 34% from last year. What's going on?" Rick said, "We're losing deals to Massey Ferguson." Stephen said, "Massey Ferguson doesn't have market share in this territory." Rick said, "They do now." Stephen said, "Why?" Rick explained the field demo. He explained Vernon Gast. He explained the plow pull and the crowd and the 6 lost sales. Stephen listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You told a crowd of potential customers that the competitor's product couldn't perform, and then it did." Rick said, "I was talking about architecture." Stephen said, "Rick, farmers don't buy architecture. They buy results." Rick said, "The John Deere pulled it faster." Stephen said, "By 9 seconds." Rick said, "That's still faster." Stephen said, "For $100,000 more." Rick didn't answer. Stephen said, "Do you understand what you did?" Rick said, "I made a comparison." Stephen said, "You set up a test you couldn't control and gave your competitor the opportunity to prove you wrong in front of your customer base, and he did." Rick said, "I didn't think he'd show up." Stephen said, "That's the problem." By the end of 2012, Torrance Ag Solutions had lost 11 long-term customers to Massey Ferguson. Total lost sales, including trade-ins, new equipment, parts, and service revenue, exceeded $1.2 million. Frank Elbert's Massey Ferguson dealership in Poplar Bluff added 2 service techs and expanded his lot space to handle increased inventory. He sold 14 tractors in 2012, up from 6 in 2011. Vernon Gast never spoke publicly about the field demo. When farmers asked him about it at the co-op or the grain elevator, He said the same thing he'd always said. The tractor does what I need it to do. But word traveled, not through social media. Not through organized campaigns, just through conversations between farmers who had watched Rick Torrance make a claim and Vernon Gast disprove it. And those conversations carried weight because they were about something farmers understood better than any dealer presentation or horsepower chart. They were about what actually happened in the field. In 2014, John Deere pulled Torrance Ag Solutions' exclusive dealership agreement for Southeast Missouri. Rick was allowed to keep his location in Dexter, but his territory was reduced and he was no longer permitted to sponsor the Farm Progress Show field demonstration. The official reason given was underperformance in new equipment sales. Rick knew the real reason. Vernon Gast's Massey Ferguson 8680 is still running. It has 6,800 hours on it now. Vernon rebuilt the clutch in 2018 at 5,400 hours. He replaced the hydraulic pump in 2020. He's had no major engine work. In 2019, Vernon's son, Aaron, came back to the farm after working construction in St. Louis for 8 years. Aaron asked his father if they should look at upgrading the 8680. Vernon said, "Why?" Aaron said, "It's 10 years old." Vernon said, "It still pulls." Aaron didn't ask again. In 2021, a farm equipment journalist writing a story about regional brand loyalty called Vernon and asked if he remembered the 2011 field demo. Vernon said, "I remember." The journalist asked if Vernon had planned to challenge Rick Torrance that day. Vernon said no. The journalist asked what changed. Vernon said, "He told 200 people my tractor couldn't do something I knew it could do." The journalist asked if Vernon felt like he'd proven something. Vernon said, "I didn't prove anything. The tractor did." The journalist asked if Rick Torrance had ever apologized. Vernon said no. The journalist asked if Vernon expected him to. Vernon said no. The journalist asked why. Vernon said, "Because apologizing would mean admitting he was wrong, and men like Rick don't admit that." Rick Torrance still runs Torrance Ag Solutions in Dexter, Missouri. His territory is smaller. His sales volume is lower. He doesn't sponsor field demonstrations anymore. In 2022, a farmer walked into Rick's dealership asking about a used John Deere 8345R. While they were talking, the farmer mentioned he'd been thinking about Massey Ferguson. Rick said, "Why would you do that?" The farmer said, "I heard they pull pretty good." Rick said, "Who told you that?" The farmer said, "Vernon Gast." Rick didn't respond. The farmer bought the John Deere, but the conversation stayed with Rick for days. Because 11 years after a 4-minute plow pull in a demonstration field, Vernon Gast's name was still costing him sales. Ed Pulliam still farms 980 acres south of Bloomfield. He bought a second Massey Ferguson in 2016, an 8727 with 400 horsepower. He's never bought another John Deere. Carl Dietrich retired in 2020. His son took over the farm and still runs the Massey Ferguson 8690 his father bought in 2011. Raymond Stoll's Massey Ferguson 8670 has 7,100 hours on it. He's rebuilt the transmission once. The engine has never been opened. Frank Elbert's Massey Ferguson dealership in Poplar Bluff now carries 35 to 40 tractors on the lot. He added a second location in 2018. His service bays are booked 3 weeks out. When people ask him how he grew the business so fast, he tells them the same story. A John Deere dealer made a claim he couldn't back up. A farmer with a Massey Ferguson proved him wrong in front of 200 people. And 11 of those people made a decision. They didn't switch because of a sales pitch. They switched because of what they watched happen in 4 minutes on a Saturday morning in September. Vernon Gast turned 71 this year. He still farms 520 acres outside Advance. The Massey Ferguson 8680 is still his primary tractor. The paint is faded, the seat is worn, but the engine runs smooth, the hydraulics hold pressure, and the transmission still pulls 12 bottoms through Missouri clay at 4.1 miles per hour without downshifting. Exactly the way it did on September 17, 2011, when Rick Torrance said it couldn't.